verse 28. Exodus 16 and verse 28 says, "And the Lord said to Moses, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments and my laws?" Why is that the response of God? Yeah, and by the way, this seems like some small thing, right? What have they done? At this point, this is what they've done. They've gone out every day, and they've collected their manna like they were supposed to, and they've eaten it, and they did it the first day, and the second day, and the third day. And on the day before the Sabbath, I'm going to assume that they gathered 2 omers, doing exactly what he said. But then Sabbath morning, what did some of them do? They went to look. Now, that doesn't seem all that serious, does it? All they were doing was looking. It doesn't necessarily say that they went out to gather. On the 7th, well, I guess it does. On the 7th day, some of them went out to gather. But the problem is he said what? Don't do it on the 7th day. But it seems reasonable. This is early in the process. They've never really done this before. This is the first week. This is the first Sabbath. Isn't this a minor mistake? That's exactly what it was. And we're not to put the Lord to the test.
And they knew the law. They went out there to violate the law.
Right. They knew what they were supposed to do. They weren't ignorant. They doubted. And his response is, how long will you refuse to keep my commandments? What transgression of God's requirements for us is small enough that it doesn't matter to him? And there is none. As a good friend of mine used to say, God doesn't deal in the trivial. When he sets forth something, he means it. And there's a reason for it. And so, this frustrates God. You know what that means? When I transgress God's law, when I don't do something that God has told me to do, or I do something that he's asked me not to do, this is how he reacts to me. How long will you refuse to keep my commandments? See, the Lord has given you the Sabbath. Therefore, on the 6th day, he gives you bread for 2 days. Remain each of you in his place. Let no one go out of his place on the 7th day. This really gets back to not respecting the law that he had given about the Sabbath. So the people rested on the 7th day. Now, the house of Israel called its name manna. I did a little research. Have no idea why it was called manna. Somebody suggests that the word manan, which is M-A-N-A-N, means gift or provision, and that this was a play on that word. I don't know if that's the case or not. But they called it manna. It says, it was like coriander seed, white, and the taste of it was like wafers made with honey. All right, so this is what coriander seed looks like. Don't make the mistake of thinking that this is the appearance of manna. This is the color of manna. So it's described as being kind of a whitish, off-whitish color, like a coriander seed, and tasting like wafers made with honey. I'm not exactly sure what wafers made with honey taste like. I do know what honey wheat bread tastes like. When you make bread with honey, what's the result? It's a little sweeter. It's not necessarily a cake, but it's got a sweetness to it. It's a pleasant thing to eat. And so what we learned from this, at least to me, is that it wasn't something that was tasteless. It wasn't something that tasted bad. It wasn't something that there was any reason to have an aversion to. That becomes important later. There was something pleasant about it. Moses said, "This is what the Lord has commanded. Let an omer of it be kept throughout your generation, so that they may see the bread with which I fed you in the wilderness when I brought you out of the land of Egypt." This is why there's an omer of it in the Ark of the Covenant. Because God said, you keep an omer of it so you never forget what I've done. As the Lord commanded Moses, so Aaron placed it before the testimony to be kept. The people of Israel ate the manna 40 years till they came to a habitable land. They ate the manna till they came to the border of the land of Canaan. An omer is the 10th part of an ephah. And so we have this substance that God provides to them when they cry out to God and say we're hungry. And they eat it for 40 years. Now, it's important to keep in mind that in the middle of that time frame, in fact, middle is not even the right word to use. Early in that 40 years, they actually got all the way to the edge of the promised land and were told to go in, and what did they do? They refused to go in. They refused to follow the commandment of God. That's why they wandered for 40 years in the wilderness. God continued to feed them. And so they ate this for 40 years. Would they have had to eat it for 40 years had they obeyed the command of God? No, they wouldn't have had to eat it for 40 years. But they did. Now, what we're going to start seeing as we go to Numbers chapter 11 is like many of us, the life that God prescribes for us doesn't satisfy all of our wants. And so we get frustrated with what God supplies. And that's what happened to these folks. The people complained, it says in Numbers 11, in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned among them and consumed some outlying parts of the camp. The people cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. And so they're murmuring and complaining, and God brings a judgment upon them. They complain about the judgment, and God relents. So the name of that place was called Tiberah because of the fire of the Lord burned among them. Now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving. And the people of Israel also wept again and said, "Oh, that we had meat to eat." We remember the fish we ate in Egypt that cost nothing. Boy, life in Egypt was great, right? Remember back when we lived in Egypt and we had all that free fish? Now, what are they leaving out of that description? The oppression, the being whipped, and the having to work as slaves, and the making of bricks every day that they whined and complained about, and the hardships. They were under bondage for 400 years. But they're not talking about being under bondage for 400 years, being beaten and mistreated by the Egyptians for 400 years, having to build bricks for the Egyptians for 400 years, and crying for deliverance from those things. No, wasn't life wonderful in Egypt? We had free fish. There's another aspect of human nature, I think, that becomes apparent in all this. What do we want? What we don't have. We tend not to be satisfied with what we have. We're not content with our circumstances. And so if we have plenty of food to eat, that's well and wonderful and great and fabulous, but I would rather have this other food. And I know my whatever I own is still good, and it still works, and it still does its job, but that one's nicer. I wish I had that one. And that's exactly what we're seeing here. They had plenty of food. They had all that they needed. They were satisfied with what they had. The manna did exactly what it was supposed to do and provided for them the nourishment and the satisfaction from their hunger that they needed, but they still wanted something else. We remember the fish that we eat in Egypt that cost us nothing, the cucumbers, the melons, the leeks, the onions, the garlic. But now our strength is dried up and there's nothing at all but this manna to look at. It's just the same meal every day. I wish we had something different. Now the manna was like coriander seed and its appearance like that of bdellium. Now that right there is a piece of bdellium. That's on the screen behind me. We know that the color was like coriander, that whitish color, but the structure of it was more like that resin that you see pictured there. I don't really understand, as a result of that, exactly what manna was. I know that it fell with the dew. I know that it melted in the heat and was gone. I know that it lasted as long as God wanted it to last, and I know that they had to prepare it and make food out of it. It's a strange substance. It isn't something that you find in the world. Which means what? It was provided by God. There's no doubt about that. And the fact that they were able to get up every morning and go out and collect a day's worth of food that they knew was being provided by the God of heaven should have done what with them? It should have satisfied them. Something else. It should have built their faith. Every morning when the day came up and there it was, they knew what? They knew that God was with them, that God was looking out after them, that God was providing for them. But did it translate to faith like that in these people? Keep in mind, this was happening every day. And then they got to the Jordan River and God said, okay, now cross it, the land is yours. I'm going to play with the circumstances a little bit. I gave you food every day. When I said it would be there, it's been there. You can trust what I say. Cross over the Jordan River and take the land. I've given it to you. It's in your hands. They sent the spies over, and the spies came back and said, what? Yeah, those people are giants, and we can't, their armies are, we can't win. See, it didn't translate into them actually trusting God the way that they should have. Every single morning they went out, and there it was. They knew that God was there. They knew that God was providing. They knew that God's promises were true because they saw it day after day after day. The manna was like coriander seed, its appearance like that of bdellium. The people went about and gathered it and ground it in hand mills or beat it in mortars and boiled it in pots and made cakes of it. And the taste of it was like the taste of cakes baked with oil. When the dew fell upon the camp in the night, the manna fell with it. Moses heard the people weeping throughout their clans, every one at the door of his tent, and the anger of the Lord blazed hotly. And Moses was displeased. Not good enough. What God did for them was not good enough. What God provided was not enough. God felt it was enough, but it wasn't enough for their appetites. Miss Karen, did you have a comment? Yep. They did. And there's a if you keep reading in this chapter, there's a section on the quails at the end of this chapter as well. The quail story is one of my favorites, especially when they were complaining about it and God answered their complaints by doing what? sending so much quail that it made him sick. But the point is that over and over and over again we see this. They're never satisfied. And we do the same thing if we're not careful. God says, this is how you worship me. This is what I'm looking for. These are the things I need you to do. And people are not satisfied with that worship. People want to augment it. They want to add things to it. They want to make it more exciting. It's the same thing. Well, this prayer thing, that's a good thing. And this singing from the heart thing, that's a good thing. And studying your word, that's a good thing. But wouldn't it be better if? Wouldn't it satisfy us more if? And interestingly enough, it started with an organ. And then an organ and a piano. And then an organ and a piano and a rock and roll band. And then flashing lights and smoke. And you go to a quote-unquote worship assembly in some places today, and you can't tell the difference between being there or being at a secular music concert. Because people aren't satisfied with what God has given them. Which, by the way, is the very thing that we need to satisfy what we lack. We need the memorial of the death of Christ so that we don't forget it. We need to make our requests known to Him through prayer. We need to be fed from His Word. We need those things. But we want leeks and cucumbers and fish and all sorts of other things that we think are going to be better. We're not any different from these folks. We shouldn't be too hard on them because we act exactly the same way. It was too much for them to go out and gather. And then it was too much for them not to go out and gather. I want you to think about that. People are never happy. This is what I'm giving you for food. Really? That's all? I told the story last week of the family that came and wanted help. And one of the elders where I was working at the time brought them to the grocery store and started filling up the cart, was to pay their grocery bill. And the woman went, I'm going to have to take this home and cook it. Yeah, and? Well, I want a hot meal, a prepared meal. I want something I don't have to work for. That's the way we act. And that is not the way that we ought to be with God. What should they have done every single day after they collected this omer of manna and brought it? They should have offered thanksgiving to God for their daily bread. Jesus teaches us to ask God, give us this day our daily bread. They received it. When I ask for something and then I receive it, what is the natural response? To say thank you, to show my gratitude. And that's the way we ought to be. Deliver us from our slavery. He delivered them from their slavery. What should they have done? Been grateful. But instead he had to ask them, how long will you be disobedient? Was it too much for him to ask them to follow him? Because, by the way, don't miss out on that. That's all he asked of them. He brought them out there, and then you remember the pillar? That was a pillar of cloud by day and a fire by night. What did he say? Just follow me. When I move, you move, and when I stay stationary, you stay stationary. Just follow me, and I'll take you exactly where you need to go. And all the while, I'll give you food every day. I'll give you water to drink. I'll make sure your clothes don't wear out. I will take care of you. And instead of getting up every day and saying, thank you for bringing me to this place, thank you for this food, thank you for this clothing, thank you for the things that you have done for me, they complained. Yes, sir. Now, and let's be fair, that was a big ordeal. A lot of tents to pack up, a lot of equipment to move around. When they pitched camp, they had a particular way to do it. It wasn't necessarily easy, but it also wasn't impossible. It wasn't more than what was reasonable. Go ahead, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Okay. He really hadn't asked a lot of them, and he had provided a lot to them. But it wasn't what they expected. And see, there's where our problem comes in. When we start making expectations about what God should do, that's when we get ourselves in a lot of trouble. Do you remember Naaman the leper? Who wanted to be cured of his leprosy, and he was told how to be cured of his leprosy, but he got angry about the cure and complained, I thought you would do some great thing. I thought it would be different than this. I thought it would look like this. I thought that the Messiah would come in on a white steed with a sword and would slay all the enemy and sit on a throne. That's what the Jews said when Jesus came. I thought it would be different than this. And so they were disappointed in what God did and rejected the blessings of God for it. Don't think that we don't get ourselves in that same kind of trouble. When we get up and we complain to God because it doesn't turn out the way we think it ought to be, what we essentially are doing is saying to God, what? My will is better than yours. This is what I want to happen. And because this is what you gave us, I'm not happy. This would be better. Isn't that what they were saying? I know we got this manna every day, but it would be better if we had fish and cucumbers and leeks and melons. It would be better if our worship was more exciting. It would be better if we could sing and we could dance. It would be better if it was about satisfying our stomachs and our bodies. It would be better if it wasn't feasting in love, if it was feasting on, what is it, the Dr. Seuss called it, roast beast? That way it can be any kind of animal. It would be better if it was what I wanted to do, is a problem that man has always had. And what we see in these stories repeatedly is what? What's God's reaction to that kind of an attitude? He burned in his anger. And interestingly enough, in Numbers, we learn that anger was so great that he disciplined them. How did he discipline them? With fire. He consumed them with fire. What is that possibly a shadowing of? Right. I mean, behold, there is nothing new under the sun. Yes, sir.
I think, bringing this whole lesson to us today, it goes more, I guess, beyond the physical, idea of us kind of being upset because we really wanted a steak dinner and we're provided a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. How often do we reject the spiritual bread of heaven for the here and now? And really that shows what Paul condemned the Corinthians for, being carnally minded. The flesh versus the spirit. That's the battle.
Yeah, and it's the same thing here. Right, it's the same thing here. Because they actually had something to satisfy the flesh. They actually did. So it wasn't a lack of something to satisfy their hunger.
And we know that it was from a sustenance standpoint, it was perfect food. It was what God had provided them.
Right. But it wasn't
They wanted the carnal.
what they wanted. They wanted something that tickled the tongue. By the way, you know what the New Testament teaches us about the spiritual bread? We don't want to listen to that. We want something that does what? That tickles our ears. See, they wanted something that would tickle their tongue. And we want something that tickles our ears. We want a message that instead of telling me that this is right and this is wrong and I have to change and not live that way any longer and that I am the one who is wrong. Instead of that kind of a message, I want a message that tells me I'm okay and that what I'm doing is okay and that I can do anything that I want to do and it's okay. That's the message I want. Yes, ma'am. And it's what we all do, essentially. I mean, that's what we all do if we're not careful. We make it look a little different. Instead of adapting the doctrine that you just had reference to in the Catholic faith, we adopt a Calvinist viewpoint that says once saved, always saved. Or we adopt the Calvinist viewpoint that says, hey, we're either chosen or we're not. It's not our fault. And we like that one, right? It's not my fault. God made me this way. Or we accept the doctrine that says love is all that matters, and then we define what love means. It's the same thing. Whatever we want, that's what we put in place of the truth. And then we soothe our conscience by saying that what we want is truth. We have to think about how important these things are. Now, we actually don't have much time, but go to Deuteronomy 8 real quick. It'll take a couple of minutes for the kids to get in here. Deuteronomy 8, verse 1 through 3. The whole commandment that I commanded you today, you shall be careful to do, that you may live and multiply and go in and possess the land that the Lord swore to give to your fathers. And you shall remember the whole way that the Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness, that he might humble you, testing you to know what was in your heart, whether you would keep his commandments or not. And so we find out here that all of these things, this will you go out and gather? Will you not go out and gather on the Sabbath? Will you be satisfied with what I give you? Will you do these things? It was God testing to see whether or not they would keep his commandments. He humbled you and let you hunger. Now I want you to notice that. He let them hunger. He brought them to the point that they were hungry so that they would ask for something so that he could provide it to them. He humbled you and let you hunger and fed you with manna, which you did not know, nor did your fathers know. That is, you didn't have any idea of what manna was. that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of the Lord. See, there is this underlying message in the provision of the manna, in the way that he provided the manna. He let them get hungry. He let them ask God for it. He gave them something that they didn't expect, that they didn't know about. This was not some type of food that they went, oh, we know what this is. And he did it so that they would know that man doesn't live by bread alone, but by every word that proceeds out of the mouth of God, that there's something more important than sustaining the body. That's what he wants them to understand. Verse 16 of the same chapter. He fed you in the wilderness with manna that your fathers did not know, that he might humble you and test you to do you good in the end. The whole process was for their own good. To develop faith and confidence in God within them. How many of us look at the challenges of life that way? How many of us look at those days when things aren't going the way that we hope? We're hungry. As, okay, this is a test. How am I going to handle this situation? How many of us look at those days when we're being tested or tempted in some way as being an opportunity instead of being something that is a burden to us? See, all of those bad days, that's what they are to us. They're bad, right? Do you know what he's telling these folks? These circumstances exist because God wants something for your good to come out of it. And so you get to the book of James, and James says, consider it all joy when you incur various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. This process that we go through in life, where our faith is tested, where our trust and confidence in God and His Word is tested day by day, when we are faced with these circumstances that cause us to have to make a choice, whether we're going to obey God or we're going to strike out and try to do our own thing or we're going to complain, those things are there to help build and complete our faith. And they ought to be counted as good, not as bad. But that's not always the way we act, is it? All right, I got to stop. If the good Lord wills, we'll pick up next time in Joshua chapter 5. And I'll update the slide behind me with all the new lessons. But keep this in mind. We're going to move through, at this point, various passages of Scripture from Deuteronomy all the way to Revelation, where this manna, our bread from heaven theme, reappears. And there's a point to this. There's a lesson that we're being taught. And we've already been given a little bit of insight here in Deuteronomy 8, and that is, we need to learn that man shall not live by bread alone, that just satisfying the body is not what life is about, that there's something much more important that we need to worry about. And we're going to see that proven to us throughout the